And welcome back to EWTN's continuing coverage of the Knights of Columbus, the 133rd Supreme Convention, coming to you live from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I'm joined on set, I'm Doug Keck, by Carl Anderson, the Supreme Knight for the Knights of Columbus, who you just saw give a wonderful, wonderful, powerful report and speech. Carl, that powerful report, especially the whole idea of holding up the cross and standing up for the Christians in the Middle East. Why was that important to you to make that the centerpiece, really, of your report?
Well, this year, is so dramatic of what's happening. We started helping Christians in the Middle East last fall, but the situation, which many of us thought could not get any worse, is just getting to a horrible state. And there isn't enough assistance by governments helping our people. I say our people because they're Christians. So as we were preparing for this convention, it just appeared that we needed to find a way of symbolizing this. And of course, these olive wood crosses made by Christians in Bethlehem seem to be a wonderful way of doing that, to get our people in solidarity. And so we hope that what we're going to do is go to the parish level with smaller crosses, and then parishioners can make a donation, they can take a cross and put it up in their home as a symbol of solidarity, family to family, Christians here and Christians in the Middle East.
It's interesting, too, with something like this, because it helps the people in Bethlehem, the Christians who create these, and then at the same time, the money then is going to support the people struggling in the Middle East under the oppression. And at the same time, it gets the Knights involved with doing something that's important. You know, it was interesting because you have different categories you have in your report every year. And I thought it was interesting because you've got faithful citizenship and culture of life. And I thought it was interesting that you included the section talking about the Middle East under faithful citizenship. What does that have to do with being a faithful citizen of the United States?
Well, we were putting together the whole question here in Philadelphia, the birthplace of American independence, Declaration of Independence, that our right as Americans for the free exercise of religion really is what is the crux of the problem so many other places in the world. There are now reports that of the 198 countries, 192 countries in the world, about 108 of them, Christians are persecuted. And we've got to do something to help them. This is just a scandal, that this is a global epidemic of violence against Christians.
Well, you quoted the whole headline from the New York Times in your report about the end of Christianity in the Middle East, ? And you went on to say the world remains largely silent. You go on to say neither the United States government nor the United Nations are doing enough. Why is that, in your opinion?
Maybe we should ask our elected representatives why they're not doing enough. But part of it is that many of the Christians are being categorized as internally displaced persons, not as refugees. So because it's an internal problem, not an international problem, the UN is not giving it a higher priority. For our own government, I think that's a question we need to begin asking our elected representatives. Why aren't we doing enough?
Right. And also, it seems like they're unwilling to look at this, in a sense, as a Christian problem, of saying these people are being targeted because of their faith, not because they just happen to live in some part of the world.
Yes. And of course, Christians aren't the only minorities in these areas that are having this problem, but Christians are the majority minority, if I could put it this way. And also, we have to remember, these are communities that have been there for 2,000 years. These are not newcomers into the region. In fact, the Christian community in every one of these countries predates the Muslim communities by hundreds of years. So they have every right to be there. They've made tremendous cultural contributions to that region, and it is just appalling that we're allowing this community to be religiously cleansed. Pope Francis has called it genocide. So what are we going to do?
Right, exactly. We always say never again, and then somehow we find ourselves back into a situation like this. In the section you have on the cultural life, you talk about, here we are in Philadelphia, like you said, the city of religious freedom for the United States. There's a great quote you pulled out. Paul VI wrote, "The split between the gospel and the culture is undoubtedly the drama of our time." Now you're thinking Paul VI, so that must have been, what, in the late 60s or sometime in the 70s that he actually said that.
I think it's very, very clear that Paul VI was a visionary in so many ways. I mean, usually we think about this when we talk about the culture of life in terms of Humanae Vitae and what he saw coming if we disregarded the Creator's design for marriage and family and the transmission of human life. But here too, it's very, very clear.
Right, exactly. Another quote that you pulled out, you mentioned right near the end of the talk, was from Charles Carroll, talking about 50 years later. I guess he was the last one of the surviving members of the signers, and he talked about the fact of hoping that religious liberty would remain. And then I guess a year later he wrote, "God grant that this religious liberty may be preserved in these states to the end of time, and that all believing in the religion of Christ may practice the leading principles of charity, the basis of every virtue." Who would ever thought that we'd have to even be dealing with this today?
Yes.
Here in the United States, let alone in the Middle East.
Who would have thought it? So I think this is a time for deep reflection for Catholics in America. I believe we are facing a constitutional crisis over the breadth and meaning of the free exercise of religion. We have many people who want to say it only means freedom of worship. So go in your church, go in your synagogue, close the door, and you're free to do what you want. But the founders didn't believe that. Right. The founders wanted a robust communities of faith that were engaged in the community, helping to set values, helping to do charity, helping to establish brotherhood, because they saw that the biblical values of Christianity were bedrock to a free society. People don't want to speak about that anymore, but that is true. That is true. The Liberty Bell. What's written on the Liberty Bell? What's inscribed on the Liberty Bell? From Leviticus, proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. The founders knew that this moral commitment of the Judeo-Christian culture and civilization is what made free democratic institutions possible. So they weren't looking to restrict it. They were looking to give it robust breadth within the community with respect for diversity and for conscience. John Paul II said, conscience is what is most authentic about the human person. So unless we really safeguard this in a meaningful way, we cannot protect human dignity.
It's interesting, too, because you talk about standing up. That's what the Knights are about, standing up for the faith. We have to do that. The Knights are standing up. They're not going to forget, just like the Knights in the past didn't forget the persecution that was going on in Mexico. You're not going to forget what's going on in the Middle East. But you also then use a quote by St. Thomas More about, "I do nobody harm, I say none harm, I think none harm." Why did you put that in there?
Well, because I want people to understand that the dynamic of Christianity is love of neighbor. And so don't try to misconstrue church teaching as some kind of a hate crime or notion of intolerance, when it isn't. It's motivated by a sincere effort to help people achieve human flourishing. And so if we disagree on a moral position or we disagree on a political position, that doesn't mean we think you're an enemy and need to be destroyed. Right. We think you're a brother. And I also quoted St. Augustine because St. Augustine said, there's many people who are our greatest enemies, who they don't realize it, but someday they'll be our friends.
Do you find today that one of the things, just before I let you go, because I know you got a busy schedule, the idea that it used to be we could disagree, even severely disagree with one another, and still respect each other. Today it seems to be if we disagree, I must destroy you. I have to take you down. You go from being somebody who has a different opinion to you're a bad person or there's something wrong with you. Why has that changed?
I think it's changed precisely because we've moved away from the Christian values that underlie democracy. Think about it. If we're having a discussion between neighbors, if my motivation is love of neighbor and the common good, I don't seek your destruction. I may seek your conversion, or I try, as the Lord said, if your neighbor asks for your coat, give him two. If he asks you to walk a mile, walk 2 miles. I might walk 2 miles in your direction to try to reach an agreement. But thinking that you have to destroy your opposition because you can't debate him reasonably or effectively is not a Christian understanding at all. It's something else.
Well, we thank you so much, and we'll stand with you on the cross, and we hope to see this spread throughout all the parishes, and thank you so much for your wonderful report and the great work the Knights do year after year. It's simply amazing.
Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much. Speaking here with Carl Anderson, the Supreme Knight of Columbus, and it's the 133rd Supreme Knight Convention coming to you live from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and we have much more ahead. Stay with us. And welcome back to EWTN's continuing live coverage of the Knights of Columbus's 133rd Supreme Convention, coming to you live from the Convention Center right here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I'm Doug Keck, and I'm on set with His Excellency, the Most Reverend William E. Laurie, Archbishop of Baltimore, and today, more importantly, the Supreme Chaplain of the Knights for the Knights of Columbus. And we'll tell us about this spirituality that we have for the Knights of Columbus. Why is it always important here as we see? Maybe let me ask you this question. We hear that siren in the background. Let me change this question. You've been working on religious liberty, and it strikes me that there's an alarm that needs to be sounded.
You know, there really is. Religious, like all liberty, like all God's gifts, they are beautiful, they are sturdy, but they need to be cherished and protected. In the Middle East, we see overt religious persecution. We see people being beheaded, dispossessed, exiled, mostly because they're Christians. And Pope has said there's more martyrs today than even in the first centuries of the Church, an extraordinary statement. In the West, it's less obvious, although maybe a little more obvious in the wake of the same-sex marriage decision. But a lot of what's happening is that religion is beginning to lose its place, its grip on our culture. As that happens, more and more voices and forces in our culture are emboldened to try to marginalize it, to reduce religious freedom simply to freedom of worship, to eliminate as much as possible what we call the freedom of exercise, the ability to live our faith at home, at work, in the culture in general.
In the public square itself.
In the public square, and to do so sometimes by laws, sometimes by bad court decisions, sometimes by government regulations, and sometimes even by threatening to remove tax exemption.
Right, exactly.
In a way that would really hobble the life of the church.
Well, one of the sections, there's a beautiful picture of you right on the section on page 33 in the report that gets published, Carl Anderson's report, Faithful Citizenship, and in that he had that quote from a Maryland Gazette in 1754 who said the Catholics, he wrote, by the very principle of religion can never be faithful subjects. And you think about how harrowing that is today. Today, I wonder whether it's not only that some people view us as you can't be a faithful subject or a good American, you can't be a good person if you actually believe or try to live out the precepts of the faith.
If you, it's always going to be the case that things that the church teaches are countercultural. They go against popular opinion. We're often going to be on the wrong side of the polls, and we're going to sometimes even be on the wrong side of public policy. But the test of religious liberty is whether or not you can do that in a culture. On issues like marriage, on issues like life, on issues like contraception, it is said that our teaching is against women. It is against people of a homosexual inclination. It is discriminatory, not unlike the Jim Crow laws of old, so very unjust laws against African Americans.
Which is a ridiculous analogy, but
it is. But
it impacts people, and it's a good little soundbite that gives people an answer to a question.
And that's kind of how that obnoxious piece from the Gazette is being repeated in our times. Now, our answer to this, I think we have to begin with a very, very basic principle that St. John Paul II taught us, really St. Paul taught us, is that the only thing that conquers evil and injustice is love. So we go about with the strength of love, with the truth of love, defending our religious liberty for sure, but doing so in a way that is not only civil, but also is looking out to the common good of humanity. We're not defending religious liberty because we want special treatment for the church. We're defending religious liberty because not only do we want to worship as we believe is correct, we want the freedom to take what our church teaches and apply that in works of charity, education, and healthcare. And that is exactly where government regulations, unjust laws, and bad course decisions are beginning to hobble us.
Right, including EWTN.
EWTN, Little Sisters.
Right.
I mean, how can you look at EWTN and say this isn't a work of religion?
I know, right.
How can you look at the Little Sisters of the Poor serving the elderly poor in these beautiful religiously based homes and say this is not a work of religion?
Well, it's interesting because our founders had it right. They weren't trying to protect, in a sense, the government from religion. They were trying to protect the religious expression from the government, that the government wouldn't impose upon it. Of course, states had state religions in particular areas, so this was a federal issue. But today it's been turned upside down to the fact that, you know, if you're exercising your religion, like you said, you're being intolerant. Sometimes I wonder, and let me ask you, you've been in charge of the whole Fortnight for Freedom, standing up for religious liberty this last couple of years, taking a lead on that. Sometimes I wonder, why do these people seem to care so much about our opinion or your opinion on a particular issue if they're not Catholic, they don't believe it anyway, but they seem intent on not only ignoring it, but forcing you to not believe it either?
I think that as secularism takes hold, secularism has an orthodoxy all its own, and it does not brook dissent. And the biggest, one of the foundations of it is the view that sexual license and the freedom to live any kind of a life you want, create any kind of a world you want, that's fundamental. A church like the Catholic Church, which not only worships, but sees belonging to that church as a way of life and is determined to bring our values and truths into the culture, is seen as a sort of an impediment to that. It's a contrary worldview that needs to be at best marginalized, and I think that's what we see going on. Should we be discouraged? No. You know, way back when in the 3rd century, there's a letter written, we don't know who wrote it, but it was addressed to Dionysius, and this is in times of persecution, and it said, you know, we Christians, we live in the world, we work in the world, we dress like other people, we eat the same food as other people, but we are also in an alien world. we were also persecuted, we're despised. But it didn't go on to say, poor us, ain't it awful? It said, yet, small, persecuted as we are the soul of this society. We are the animating principle of this society. Wonder if we got that kind of faith today. That's what Pope Francis is talking about when he speaks about about being missionary disciples. Believe we have something to offer, and even if the forces that be, the powers that be, the opinion makers tell us they don't want it, we say, but we're offering this in love, but persistent love.
Right, exactly. And one of the things the Knights of Columbus has talked about, and certainly with your Fortnight for Freedom, is catechesis. I just want to mention quickly, as Supreme Chaplain, you also put together a book, The Joy of Believing, a practical guide to the Catholic faith, which Carl Anderson wrote the foreword to. Now, that was actually, what, a series of articles in Columbia Magazine over a period of time, and then you decided to publish the book?
It was. You know, I met with all the chaplains of the order, and they said to me, Bishop, why don't you use your column to do a weekly, a monthly series on some aspect of the faith? And I said, terrific. The compendium of the Catechism had just come out. And so over a couple of years, I kind of covered the whole waterfront of the faith. And then one day I woke up and I said, wait a minute. Without thinking about it, I wrote a book. And so I got a little help in editing it. We did discussion questions.
Yes.
And so this is meant to be a kind of a one-volume summary of a summary that you can use as individuals, we can use as individuals, or in group settings, like a Knights Council meeting.
I was going to say, have any of the Knights Councils adopted this as a methodology to kind of raise the catechetical teaching level of some of our Catholics, including myself, who grew up in the 60s and 70s, where string paintings and things like collages were more popular than reading the Catechism?
No doubt about it. It's a bit remedial, but it can also be used in a parish setting.
That sounds great. Thank you so much for finding the time, and thank you for standing up for religious liberty. Talking with the Supreme Chaplain of the Knights of Columbus, the Most Reverend William E. Laurie. He's the Archbishop of Baltimore. And also you can look for his book, The Joy of Believing, a Practical Guide to the Catholic Faith, because it's available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. We'll take a short break. We'll be right back with EWTN's continuing coverage of the 133rd Supreme Convention, right from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, here at the Convention Center. Much more ahead. Stay with us. And welcome back to EWTN's continuing live coverage. It's the Knights of Columbus's 133rd Supreme Convention, coming to you live from the Convention Center right here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where in the future we will have the World Meeting of Families, as well as the Holy Father will be visiting as part of that, part of his trip in September. And I'm Doug Keck, joined on set by Iago de la Serva, who's the international media consultant for the World Meeting of Families. And we've known each other, I guess, for 12 plus years. Some people remember the program Rome Reports, which was something we worked on together to get launched, and ultimately led to what we're doing now as a Vaticano series. So what are you doing over here in the States?
I volunteered to come here and work for the World Meeting of Families because my experience and my personal life was really affected by World Youth Day in Madrid. So since
you
then,
worked on that, right?
Yeah, I was the executive director.
Right, exactly, right.
And I mean, any Pope's trip, it's really means a change in the life of many people. So this is why I would like to be part of this in Philadelphia.
Let me ask you, I don't want to say anything, but you weren't a teenager when the Pope was there in Madrid, but yet it impacted you. Was it the planning that impacted you? It was the events themselves? What impacted you?
I think the most serious impact it had, World Youth Day in Madrid had on me, was how people were transformed by the Pope. I saw this. I saw in many people.
And it continued?
And it continued. We had a lot of vocations to priesthood, a lot of vocations for religious life, a lot of vocations for marriage. And this is the thing that made me thought my work there was worth. So the idea of seeing people change their lives because the Pope touched their souls, and this is really moving. Also because we center the whole operation in two sacraments, the confession and the Eucharist. Because we thought these two sacraments were really important for the starting point of the Christian life for many young people. And when I saw that we did a poll at the end, and the results was that more than half of the 2 million people who attended Word Your Day in Madrid went to confession. This is, okay, this is worth.
So unlike the way the media likes to portray it as some kind of Woodstock for young Catholics, this actually is more of a pilgrimage than anything else. Now, do you think something like the World Meeting of Families just doesn't have the scope where you may be talking about 15,000 or 20,000 people coming here for this? Obviously, you've got the Holy Father coming at the end of it, but he's going to also be doing other things at the same time. It seems a little different because everybody knows about World Youth Day. The World Meeting of Families, not so much. Yeah. So how do you see those two working together? Or how can you bring your experience of World Youth Day into what's happening here in the World Meeting of Families?
Okay, so I think World Youth Days and World Meeting of Families are the children of the same person, John Paul II, Saint John Paul II, and they have the same idea. Sometimes we have to preach, and ordinary catechism is really important, but from time to time we have to do something extraordinary, because today's people of our age, need something really experiential. So taking people out of their normal life and experience being together with many Catholics from other countries is so fulfilling. It's so really, it really touches the soul of many people. So World Youth Day is different because it's much larger, but family meetings are always very important for two reasons. First, because we have this experience of being families together, which we don't have in World Youth Days. And second, because this World Meeting of Families is especially important because it happens just in the middle of the two synods. And the Pope has asked many people, okay, give me your input, give me your personal experience in being a Christian family, a Catholic family. And this is a great place to give witness of what living as a normal family life is. And I think this is a treasure for the whole church.
Let me ask you, you're dealing with the international side of this. What percentage are you guessing at this point would the people working on the World Meeting of Families think of the percentage of people who will be coming from outside the United States for this event?
It's very hard to say because we don't have a registration system in which we know exactly how many people are coming from each country. We know that there are delegates for almost every single country in the world coming for the conference, for the World Meeting of Families, but for the Pope's visit, it's really difficult to say. I think it would be, most of them would be Americans. And this is really important because the Pope, Pope Francis, has visited so far only, how can I say this? I mean, I'm not very good at PR, wording in English, but he has visited only third world countries. He has not been in the States or in Canada or in any country of Europe so far. So this is really important for his pontificate because it would be the first time he comes to a country in which the majority are middle class, which has never happened so far, and in a very different situation than any other country he has visited so far. So this is good not only for America, but it's very good for the Pope himself. Right. That having been in contact with Americans is always, and I'm speaking, maybe I'm projecting myself, but it's always quite interesting, very challenging in some aspects because it's completely different from Europe or Latin America. But it's always very good because if the Pope is in contact with Americans, I think this could be very important for the whole pontificate.
Over. It's interesting too. Let me ask you the question on both sides. One is, what do you think his message is going to be for the world meeting of families, especially maybe even to the church here in the United States? And what do you think will be the most surprising thing for him to learn about either Americans or the Catholics in the United States?
Are you asking me to be a prophet? I mean, I have no idea what the Pope is going to say. I know that he received a lot of suggestions, both from bishops here and also people who know this country, and also from people working in the Curia in Rome, trying to help the Pope to focus on what are the needs of this country and the Church in the United States. I really loved his answer about being, how can I say, being completely open to know something that he has never experienced. And this attitude of, really humble attitude of, I'm coming to the United States to learn, is really interesting.
Well, we've run out of time, and good luck with your work on the World Meeting of Families coming here in September. And thank you for, when you were at Santa Croce, helping to set up our intern program. We have wonderful priests from all over the world who come and visit with us every year, and it's worked out really well. Thank you, Iago.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take a short break. We'll be right back here with EWTN's continuing live coverage of the Knights of Columbus's 133rd Supreme Convention, coming to you live from the Convention Center right here at the heart of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Stay with us. And we are back here for EWTN's continuing coverage of the Knights of Columbus from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Convention Center here. I'm Doug Keck, and I'm quite honored to be joined by Cardinal Donald Wuerl, Archbishop of Washington. Welcome, Your Eminence. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
Many of our audience have seen you many times on many of our programs, especially with our EWTN News Nightly and the World Over program, now being in Washington, D.C., with you being the Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, D.C. And before we talk about the Holy Father's upcoming visit and what we can look forward to in September, I wanted to mention also the teaching of Christ. I remember when I was coming back to the church, I was looking for a book to really fill out that catechesis that I kind of string painted and collaged out of in the 60s and the 70s. And the best book I could find, I can tell you, was your book. And I want to thank you for writing that book. When was that?
That's already 40 years ago. That was 1975 when we published The Teaching of Christ. And it was for the very reason that I'm glad you said you found it helpful. Right. There was so little out there that presented a real systematic and faithful presentation. We said when we started it, we wanted it to be complete, but we wanted it to be readable and faithful.
Right.
And so that was what led us to do that.
Right, and I think it accomplished all three, which was unusual sometimes at that point in time when you picked up a book like that. Now, you've always been involved with the media. You're in one of the media capitals of the world now, so you're well trained for that. You spent many years in Rome as well. But you were doing a television program for 18 years or so, right? In
Pittsburgh, in my former diocese, we did a weekly television program, and I'm happy to say that for a long time, EWTN used the program. I remember. But every Sunday we would do a half-hour television, primarily catechetical. It was an explanation of the faith of the Church. And it ran for 18 years on broadcast and then on cable. And the whole idea of it was to help people understand what we believe and why we believe it. I enjoyed so much that program. I will always be grateful to EWTN because you used it, and that also then gave it a much wider reception. Thank you.
Right, than being in the local market there, at least initially. And also, you're an author of several books. I know I interviewed Mike Aquilino about one of your books in the past, and people can look forward to an interview that we've done with a couple of your other books they can look forward to here. But let's talk about now as your role of welcoming the Holy Father to Washington, D.C. What does that mean for you to welcome him? Now, were you the Cardinal Archbishop at the time when Pope Benedict was here?
Yes.
Okay.
And
so you've had a little experience doing this.
This will be my second time around. 2008, we had, of course, Benedict XVI and his visit. This visit is going to have a couple aspects of it quite distinct. One is going to be the Holy Father's talk to the joint session of Congress.
Now, is that the first time that's ever happened?
In the history of the Church in the United
Okay.
States, it'll be the very first time. I think there's such excitement on the visit of Pope Francis. He has a way of touching people across the board. It's not just Catholics, and it's not just faithful church-going Catholics. I find loads and loads of people coming up to me and saying, you know, I had drifted away from the church, and I started coming back. Young adults on the campuses are saying to me, I feel much more reconnected to the church with this Pope.
Right.
He has a way of touching people, but when he comes, this pastoral visit is going to be an opportunity for his message of caring for individuals, one another, recognizing the dignity of every human person, his message that every human life is a gift from God and needs to be cared for and nurtured from the beginning all the way through to its natural end. That's going to be a powerful message coming from a voice that seems to transcend all these political divisions and reach people.
Right.
But I think he's also going to be telling us, you know, you need to care for one another. You need to care for the environment. You need to care for Mother Earth, and you need to care for the poor, and you need to welcome those people who are now a part of our family, but they're immigrants. His message, I think, is going to touch a lot of lives.
Right. Now he's coming in, actually flying in from Cuba, speaking of some other opening or something a little bit different. Arrival from Cuba at 4 p.m. on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday, he's got the welcoming ceremony with President Obama at the White House. There's midday prayer with the bishops at St. Matthew's Cathedral, which is actually your cathedral then, right?
That's right.
Okay, because a lot of times people think of the Basilica in Washington and think, oh, well, that must be the cathedral for Washington, D.C., but it's not. But speaking of that, then there's the massive canonization of Junipero Serra at the Basilica of the National Shrine of Immaculate Conception. Why did the Holy Father decide to do it there?
Well, I think one of the reasons is Junipero Serra brought the faith to a large part of Mexico and certainly the coast of California. All those towns, when you go up the coast and you think you're saying the Litany of the Saints, they're all missions that he founded. The Pope keeps talking about all of us being missionary disciples, that we're supposed to share the faith, we're supposed to let other people know about the gift of the faith. Well, what better way to highlight that call today to be a missionary disciple than to canonize a disciple who was the missionary for our country, at least the western part of the country. The second reason, though, is this is the first Pope to come from the New World. And he's returning to the New World now as Pope, and he's going to canonize for the first time in the New World. We'll have a canonization in the United States.
Right, because usually that would happen in Rome.
In Rome
themselves.
And it will be a model for all of us here in the New World. You know, it was John Paul II who kept telling us, don't speak of Americas, speak of one America. Pope Francis is saying, and I'm canonizing a model of how you keep proclaiming and renewing the faith in America.
Now, is it my understanding, is he doing the Mass actually in Spanish?
Yes, he'll do the Mass in Spanish, and I think part of that is his comfort level in Spanish, obviously because it's his mother tongue, but also to highlight how many Spanish-speaking people there are in the church in the United States, and certainly in the Archdiocese of Washington, a third of
that high?
A third of the faithful would be Hispanic.
Well, not that I'm asking you to be a prognosticator, but what do you think the Holy Father's message is going to be once he leaves your diocese and heads to New York and he's speaking at the UN? What do you think his message is going to be there?
I don't know, but here's what I hope he will say while he's there, because it's a forum where this needs to be said. I hope he's going to call the world, the UN, to recognize and intervene in all these places where there is so much violence simply because of the religious faith. That people are suffering all across the world. They're suffering simply because of their faith. And I would like him, I would hope that he'll have an opportunity to challenge the United Nations to recognize that and begin to address it. The great ally of these atrocities is silence. And in the UN, there's a deafening silence about what's happening, particularly to Christians in Syria, in Iraq, in all of the Middle East, in the Holy Land, in India, in Africa, parts of Africa, the Sudan, Nigeria. You could go on and on and on. And do we ever hear the UN calling for a condemnation of this, a halt to it?
No.
There's this silence. I would hope that among the things the Pope will speak to is religious freedom.
Right. Well said. And of course, Carl Anderson in the talk, his report, challenged the Knights of Columbus to stand, and all the councils, and really ultimately all Catholics to stand with the Christians in the Middle East and the other parts of the world, in Africa, that are under attack, and who, if least we can do, is raise up the issue to say, why isn't more being done by the U.S. or by the United Nations or the world in general to stand up to protect Christians who are being persecuted for being Christians?
And that's the one thing everybody watching this program can do. They can speak up. What does it take to send an email, a text message? What does it take to make a telephone call to the people who are responsible for government to say, this is wrong, and we need to speak up?
It's the faithful citizenship of the Knights of Columbus talks about.
It is.
Very good. Thank you so much, Your Eminence.
You're very welcome.
Great to have you here. His Eminence, Cardinal Wuerl of Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for your time. We now want to bring you a look at the life of the young Connecticut priest who founded the whole thing, the Knights of Columbus. Here is Venerable Father Michael McGivney.
His name is Father Michael McGivney. He was a parish priest from a small town in Connecticut. But this humble cleric could soon be proclaimed a saint and be recognized as one of the most highly esteemed holy men ever to have been born in the United States.
Should he be canonized, Father McGivney will be the very first American-born parish priest to be declared a saint of the Roman Catholic Church.
Father McGivney was a deeply spiritual man with a great love for his fellow man.
Father McGivney really gave the Knights of Columbus its spiritual center and core.
He had enough vision to say, we have to establish something that's going to go on.
Father McGivney found a way of bringing others into his way of serving others so that there was a legacy of continuing his ministry long beyond his lifetime.
Father Michael McGivney may not be a household name, but for nearly 2 million men around the world, he is a person deeply revered.
This is really a visionary person who sees into the future.
Almost a century before the Second Vatican Council, Father McGivney saw the need for the laity to step up and have a greater role in the work of the Church and in the renewal of society.
He is the founder of one of the largest fraternal societies in the world, begun by less than 24 men in the basement of a church in New Haven, Connecticut. the Knights of Columbus. The story of Father McGivney begins over 125 years ago, in a troubled time torn by violence, prejudice, and hate. Mid-19th century America. The population is rapidly changing as an unprecedented number of Irish immigrants escape to America, fleeing a dreadful potato blight.
Ireland had fallen into a terrible state. Literally 1 million people had died of starvation, and another 1.5 million plus emigrated for other places because life in Ireland had become so intolerable.
The 19th century saw a tremendous influx of immigrants. Many of them, if not most of them, were Catholic. And so they brought with them a religion that was thought to be anti-democratic. They brought with them an allegiance to the Holy Father in Rome, and these teeming masses were thought to be a threat to the established order.
Catholics and the Pope are the Antichrist.
There was an intense amount of hatred of Catholics in the United States, and it's kind of been swept under the doormat of history. If you take a close look at it, you'll find that Catholics were often killed for being Catholic, that they were ostracized in communities across the United States. Their churches were burned.
It is into this world of hate and prejudice that Michael McGivney is born in Waterbury, Connecticut in 1852.
His parents were both immigrants, and they both came at the time of the famine. They came actually from the same county, County Cavan. They moved to Waterbury and met there and married.
The McGivney story is the story of all immigrant families. Feared, despised, distrusted, they tried desperately to scratch out a new life in a new world, clinging to each other and to their faith for support.
From colonial times, Catholics were a minority. This was particularly true in Connecticut, where the Congregational Church was actually the established church long after the United States had come into being.
In 1855, when Michael is just a child, a powerful new figure enters the lives of the McGivney family. He will bring light and hope to their troubled world and have a huge influence on Michael's future. His name is Father Thomas Hendricken, a native of Ireland who has been tapped to lead the Catholic Church in Waterbury.
Father Hendricken was a large, imposing man who had a tremendous force of personality.
The local Catholic population has grown to such a size that on Sundays, Hendricken's small church is packed to the rafters.
People had to gather outside the walls of the church because there was no room left inside. And when it was cold and wet and rainy, they knelt in the mud or in the snow in order to assist at Mass.
So Hendricken raises money and builds a new church large enough to accommodate his flock. He turns the old church building into the East Main Street Grade School. It teaches the 100 or so children in the town lucky enough to be given an education.
Father Michael was a graduate of grammar school, which was quite unusual. I believe there are 8 or 9 children in his graduating class. This is the time when Waterbury's population was between 15 and 20,000. So very few children went to school.
For the McGivneys, East Main Street is a godsend. Patrick and Mary are ambitious for their children. teaching them at home before they are old enough to start school. When Michael is just 6 years old, he sits for the entrance exam and does so well, he is allowed to skip 2 grades. Michael is a very bright boy who excels at his studies. He graduates at 13, 3 years before the other children of his age. As the oldest son, he's a natural leader, and he looks up to Father Hendricken.
Michael McGivney, who saw in Father Hendricken the kind of priest who would take charge, get things done, and do what needed to be done.
Inspired by Father Hendricken, Michael decides that he too wants to be a priest.
The oral tradition is that his father was a little hesitant about this, but there's really no historical records to say that. But that's pretty much what the family says. And it was his parish priest, Father Hendricken, who encouraged him by helping him to figure out how he could get enough education to enter the seminary.
Michael takes a job in a local factory making spoons. But Father Hendricken believes that Michael should not give up on his desire to become a priest.
He saw young Michael J. McGivney and saw that he was a hard-working boy, that he was a religious boy, and somebody who would be apt for the priesthood. It was Father Hendricken's guidance which overcame Patrick's concern.
Father Hendricken was a model pastor of his time, and he saw in the young Michael McGivney a special individual who had greatness within him and a future that could really make a contribution.
In September of 1868, 16-year-old Michael leaves the factory and heads to St. Hyacinthe Seminary in Quebec to begin his studies. It is a far tougher challenge than his grade school. The seminary demands a mastery of Latin and French and an understanding of ancient Greek. Michael hasn't studied in 3 years, and he's miles away from home, with none of his friends and family there to support him.
And it was a struggle for him. There was a difficult transition, a rude awakening, so to speak. It took him time to basically get into the swing of academics.
Despite this initial challenge, Michael quickly masters his studies. Over the next 4 years, he changes seminary twice, and along the way discovers that sports activities provide some much-needed relaxation.
Mike McGivney was a natural athlete. One of the things he found out in seminary was not only did he like baseball, but he played it very well. And this kind of teamwork and team spirit stayed with him throughout the rest of his life.
Sports help give Michael the concentration he needs to apply himself to his studies. And at the Jesuit College of Ste. Marie in Montreal, he decides to follow his love of learning and become a priest of the Society of Jesus. But it is not to be. On June 6, 1873, Michael's father dies. He is only 48 years old. Michael immediately leaves Montreal without taking his final exams to come home and rejoin his family. He leaves behind his dream of becoming a Jesuit.
He came home to be with his mother, to be with his younger brothers and younger sisters, my great-grandmother being one of them.
But Michael will not stay at home for long.
Once his father was buried and the dust settled, it was agreed by the family that he should continue his priestly education.
Michael is ready to resume his studies for the priesthood, but faces a big change with his vocation. The Bishop of Hartford intervenes and arranges for Michael to complete his studies, but not as a Jesuit. He is to finish his studies with the Order of St. Sulpice in Baltimore and become a parish priest.
What they do is teach a form of study for the priesthood that emphasizes evangelization and holiness and devotion to parish life.
This is a decisive turning point in the life of Father McGivney, moving from the vocation to the Jesuits to the vocation to be a parish priest. This puts him in solidarity in a special way with the working families of his time, and without this, it's hard to see the Knights of Columbus ever coming into existence.
In 1877, Michael McGivney is ordained by Archbishop James Gibbons at a ceremony at the Cathedral of the Assumption in Baltimore.
The ordination of Father McGivney by Archbishop Gibbons is providential. First, because Gibbons is going to play such a crucial role in the history of the Catholic Church in the 19th century.
Michael is appointed curate of St. Mary's Church in New Haven, Connecticut. For Michael, it is a homecoming, a chance to be around his family once again. Recently constructed, St. Mary's was designed to be a sumptuous structure.
The original church that had been built 50 years earlier was dilapidated and not big enough, and so they had built a big new, wonderful Gothic church, very solid, large enough for this big congregation.
It is a jewel amongst Connecticut churches, with its gracious medieval-style vaulting, its magnificent altar and lofty stained glass windows. Its grandeur matched the growing size and importance of the Catholic population in New Haven. In his new position at St. Mary's, Father McGivney quickly finds he has his work cut out for him.
He was the #2 guy behind a young priest, but had already had a pretty tough time of it. He had a very large congregation. Father McGivney's arrival was a godsend for him.
St. Mary's priest, Father Patrick Murphy, is only 32 years old, but he is ailing like a man twice his age. Father McGivney quickly finds himself doing the work of 2 men. Behind St. Mary's towering facade is a big building with big problems.
There was $200,000 in debt, which in today's dollars was probably close to $15 million. That's a huge debt.
It's gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. But it was way beyond the means of the Irish immigrants that made up the community. And they just didn't have the money to pay for it.
In addition to the financial problems, St. Mary's has another burden to bear.
New Haven is a town that had been dominated by Protestants from the earliest days, and they did not take very well to this big Catholic church on Hill House Avenue, which is one of the most elegant and well thought of avenues in the entire city. And oh my gosh, they put a Catholic church there? How dare they?
When they built St. Mary's Church, the New York Times on the front page ran a story condemning it as a blight in a prominent neighborhood.
New Haven during Father McGivney's lifetime was one of these tough New England industrial cities with teamsters, factory workers, warehousemen. These were the people that were in Father McGivney's parish. He came out of that environment at Waterbury, and the people saw in Father McGivney a man like themselves who cared about them and cared about their needs.
Despite having several thousand members, St. Mary's is still stretched to its limits. So Father McGivney sets about making St. Mary's more than a place to go on Sunday. He gathers the men in the congregation in games of baseball and sets up social times for the women, quickly making the church the center of community life. He even becomes popular with the teenagers and young adults.
He made it an entire community. He organized events of all sorts, athletic events, social events, dances, plays.
Father McGivney did not simply stay within the confines of the parish property. He was a man who went out and reached out to his parishioners.
McGivney transforms St. Mary's from a struggling pariah into the lively hub of a vibrant Catholic community.
They had a coffee hour. They made $400 from the coffee hour. All of that went into reducing the debt.
St. Mary's became a model of what a church should be, and he became a model of the parish priest.
Father McGivney was the quintessential parish priest. He was, of course, a talented man. He was a determined man. He was a natural leader.
Father McGivney's time at St. Mary's was like a love affair. He came here and it was like magic. They took him into their hearts and he loved them just tremendously.
McGivney's energy and enthusiasm began to help fill both the pews and the collection plate. But worry about the church's huge debt has taken a permanent toll on Father Murphy.
He was apparently in poor health to begin with, and he basically worked himself into an early grave.
On May 19, 1879, Father Patrick Murphy dies of typhoid malaria. He is only 34 years old. Within just a few years, Michael McGivney has been devastated by the early deaths of two important men in his life. First his father, and now Father Murphy. He knows that this is only too common an occurrence in the Irish immigrant communities around him.
Health standards were not what they are today. People died of a wide variety of things. They died of typhoid, they died of tuberculosis, died of malaria.
Many of our Catholic immigrants were working in factories that were perhaps not so well secured from a safety standpoint, and many times the father or the breadwinner of the household, passed away or was injured and died.
When a breadwinner dies, the consequences are catastrophic: bankruptcy, poverty, and families torn apart.
Father McGivney not only understood the hardships of these thousands of immigrant families, he actually lived them as a young man, and he was determined to make life better for these families. He found a way to channel the energy and resources of what would become thousands and even millions of men in trying to do the same thing.
The real challenge that Father McGivney sought to address was the plight of widows and children when the father of the family died or became incapacitated. In those days, there was not burial insurance. The benefits were very, very meager. And in the event that the breadwinner died, which was the case back in those days, the widows and the children were impoverished.
Deeply aware of this grievous problem, Father McGivney will soon be personally involved with one family's tragedy, an experience that will set him on a course to help thousands of widows and orphans across America. The Downs are a middle-class Irish-American family in New Haven. They have lifted themselves up by their bootstraps and now make a comfortable living with a newspaper stand on the green across from Yale University. But in the late 1870s, an economic crisis robs the family of their wealth. Within months, they are forced to sell their store and their home and barely avoid bankruptcy. It is a blow the father never recovers from.
Mr. Downs died suddenly, and in a sense, the world fell apart for the widow and for the children. There was no security, there was no breadwinner. And as the situation went from bad to worse, the court by and by intervened.
With no government agency to provide support, the widow Catherine Downs is left working odd jobs to make ends meet.
When a breadwinner died, the situation was critical because the courts would step in immediately and see if the widow had the financial means to continue to support the children. And if not, the family would be divided up, children placed in institutions or foster care.
Father McGivney counsels the family, but there is little he can do to save them from disaster.
The courts required that each child would be accounted for by someone who could post a bond. And the Downs family managed to do that with all except one son.
19-year-old Alfred is left without a bond.
The Downs' many friends in the community, all the connections built up being in business, these people walked away one by one.
The New Haven probate court must meet to decide Alfred's fate.
Father Michael J. McGivney stood up in the back of the courtroom and said, "I'll take him."
This is an extraordinary moment for Father McGivney because he's stepping far beyond the normal role of a Catholic priest, and he's putting himself at considerable personal risk in the judicial system.
Father McGivney was there. He stood up. He took the responsibility. Just goes to show you, there's nothing more practical than falling in love with God, because falling in love with God enables you to do practical acts of charity for others.
Father McGivney's intervention saves the Downs family. But he is only one man, and there are so many families in need.
This kind of thing was going on all the time in the 19th century. Families being broken up either by death, sometimes by abandonment by the father, very often by just poverty. And it was a very common thing that children were put before the court to be answered for.
Father McGivney sees that much more must be done to save families like the Downs.
Father McGivney's experience with the Downs family drove home two essential points. First, that he could make a tremendous difference in the life of a family. But secondly, he could not personally make that difference in the thousands of families that needed that kind of help. A bigger vehicle, a bigger way had to be found.
Adding to the problems are secret fraternal societies whose promises of increased job opportunities and a sense of belonging attract men, pulling them away from the church community.
Membership in a fraternity meant that you would get a better job or you'd get a promotion. You'd have opportunities.
In the late 19th century, men would leave the church, left the church in droves. They would join secret societies.
The Catholic leadership views these secret fraternal societies with unease. Not only are they drawing men away from the church, some are overtly anti-Catholic. But Father McGivney realizes that the societies provide real economic benefits to their members, and he begins to think about a new twist on the idea.
Father McGivney was looking for a way to have such an association, but one which was founded on Catholic principles that would appeal to Catholic men and could serve to deepen their religious life.
During the early fall of 1881, Father McGivney speaks to the men of his parish and invites them to a meeting to be held in the basement of St. Mary's. The date is October 2nd. 24 men attend.
Father McGivney suggested Sons of Columbus for this new organization. And here's a stroke of genius as well, because at the time, Catholics were considered unpatriotic and foreigners. And yet Columbus was a true American hero. He was also Catholic.
Back in the 19th century, Columbus was as big as Washington.
One of the men, James Mullen, the Civil War veteran, suggested the name Knights of Columbus. Maybe it's a touch of 19th century romanticism, but it still strikes an important chord. Those knightly virtues of standing up for what is right, of helping the weak, of protecting those who can't protect themselves.
It was the men themselves that wanted knights, because it spoke in the 19th century of such heroism and bravery and virtue.
When things get tough, there's a crisis, what better image than the knight in shining armor coming over the horizon?
The members agree to be bound by a code of spiritual principles that will guide their lives as good Catholic men.
Father McGivney named the two fundamental principles as unity and charity. And that gradually got broadened to unity, charity, fraternity.
What he was doing in creating the Knights of Columbus was designing from the ground up a society that would bind men to their faith and provide the kinds of fraternal camaraderie that the other societies offered.
But to begin with, McGivney sees the Knights of Columbus primarily as a mutual death benefit society, there to hand out money to widows and orphans.
But he also knew that if this organization was to thrive, that he really had to get it on a sound financial basis. So much so did he believe in this that he became the first financial secretary.
But Father McGivney is very clear from the start that the Knights will not be like other fraternities.
When the Knights got created, he said, we're not going to be like the Masons. The Masons are a secret society. The Knights of Columbus will be open.
There would be one other important difference. Unlike other Catholic organizations of the time, which were all an integral part of the Church, it would be authentically Catholic, but independent of the Church.
Father McGivney makes an extraordinary decision in insisting that laity be the leaders of this new organization, and not himself, or not a priest, or a bishop. This is unprecedented in the Catholic Church.
Father McGivney has great plans for the Knights, but he knows they will go nowhere without the support of the Church. And in the late 19th century, 80 years before the Second Vatican Council will dramatically transform the role of the laity in the Catholic Church, he realizes it is an unheard of and potentially risky venture.
He was a visionary in his own way. Whether he was intending to found a whole system of using lay people is something that perhaps historians will have to determine. But he was doing it in a marvelous way, and one that was worthy of being copied. And speaking back 40 years, the Second Vatican Council endorsed it.
I just marvel that somebody in the 19th century, a Roman Catholic priest, could found an organization completely run by lay people, when the priest was everything.
And as Father McGivney struggles to help the Knights grow and survive, his life becomes entwined with the fate of one young man whose story illustrates all too painfully the desperate need for a Catholic fraternity. James "Chip" Smith is an unemployed man in his early 20s, living in Ansonia, a few miles west of New Haven. He has the reputation of being a bit of a ruffian with a weakness for liquor.
Chip Smith was a young man who was, like so many others at the time, fond of drinking and fond of misbehaving once he'd been doing some drinking.
In late December of 1880, the local police receive word that an intoxicated Chip is causing a disturbance. Chip's father begs the chief of police, Daniel Hayes, to take Smith into custody to keep him out of trouble.
Chip Smith was the stereotypical example of what happened to a lot of young Irish immigrants. They would get frustrated by being shut out of all employment possibilities or advancement, and their resentment would grow against the establishment, and then they would blow.
Hayes went to arrest Smith.
Chief!
There was a struggle.
Chief, all right, I'll go with you to the
There
station.
apparently was some bad blood between the two. The pistol went off and wounded Hayes. Hayes, nevertheless, was able to take him into custody, bring him to the police station.
Once he got him into the jail, he got very ill and died.
Smith stands trial for murder in the criminal court in New Haven.
Counsel, you may bring your first witness.
His lawyer pleads that Chip is a man of diminished capacity. He's simple or slightly demented and was extremely drunk. He argues that when the struggle occurred, the gun must have gone off accidentally, so it couldn't possibly have been murder. But the judge and jury are unconvinced. Smith is found guilty.
This court sentences you, James Smith, to be confined to the county prison until the date of your execution, when you shall be hanged by the neck until death.
It's the big news story of the year in Connecticut. Many are conflicted about the verdict. Father McGivney is moved by Smith's plight. The convicted prisoner is Irish and a lapsed Catholic, so McGivney becomes a regular visitor to the jailhouse.
Father McGivney, as a parish priest, did not simply minister to those to whom it was easy to minister. He truly reached out to everyone, including those whom the community at large or society at large had given up on. One was Chip Smith.
It was some time with Father Mike going back many times for Chip Smith to finally welcome him.
Smith's lawyer appeals the sentence. Smith claims that it was the policeman's gun that had discharged the fatal round. The appeal is denied. The judge refuses to be lenient because a police officer has been shot and killed. Smith's execution is scheduled, then postponed. The process drags on for an entire year as his lawyer appeals unsuccessfully for the sentence to be commuted. Throughout those long, difficult months, Father McGivney visits Smith nearly every day, offering comfort and prayer.
It must have been something for Father Mike to sit down with this person and try to break through and find the humanity that was underneath all of the hurt and the pain that this young fellow had gone through.
As a parish priest, it was expected that Father McGivney would visit Chip Smith. What was unexpected, that he would do this every day, and do this with the intense desire that when Chip Smith climbed the scaffold, he would do so reconciled with God.
And Chip became a very deep, serious Christian through Father McGivney's influence. Eventually, he had a complete conversion.
But ministering to the condemned man takes its toll on Father McGivney. As his priest, he is expected to stay with Smith up to his execution.
Father McGivney would go day by day to visit him in his cell when he was on death row. He brought him, of course, the sacraments. He comforted him. He prepared him to die. He did not mind being identified as the friend of a prisoner on death row. And he did it in the midst of 1,000 other things, arranging church picnics, trying to keep up with various parish organizations, a whole round of things.
Father McGivney is deeply changed by counseling Smith. During Chip's last week, he spends most of each day with the condemned man. That night, Smith is calm and at peace. He is ready to accept his fate. The next morning, he goes to the gallows with great dignity. It is Friday, September 1st, 1882.
James Smith, you have been condemned to die by a jury of your peers, sentence imposed by a judge in good standing in this state. Do you have anything to say before the sentence is carried out?
The last thing in the world Michael McGivney wanted to do was to be there for the execution, but felt that Chip Smith needed him more than ever, and so he gave him the last rites, he said that last Mass for him, and he was there when he died.
Father McGivney is painfully aware that Smith's fate could be the fate of many a young Catholic man who has no guidance and support. And all through this trying time, the growth of the Knights of Columbus is stalled. There are still only 27 members.
It wasn't as if he met with a dozen men in the basement of St. Mary's Church in New Haven, and they all saluted and said, "Yes, sir," and then they went off, and the Knights became an overnight success story. There were difficulties.
It just about died those first 2 years. There was tremendous bickering and infighting, and Father McGivney endured it all.
With differences finally overcome, Father McGivney sends a letter to all of the other priests in the state, urging them to consider forming a council. And in March of 1883, he receives word from some Catholic men in nearby Meriden who have heard about the new organization and want to join. This could be a huge step forward, a move towards becoming a statewide organization. But Father McGivney delays a promised visit to Meriden. He is privately concerned. He knows that the pastor of the church in Meriden is skeptical about the idea of Catholic fraternal societies.
It was only when they said, "We'll go to the foresters and we'll ask them," that he finally said, "Okay, all right, fine, I'll come at Meriden, we'll help make things happen."
With McGivney's encouragement, the pastor in Meriden agrees, and Council Number 2 is established in May of 1883.
It was the founding of this council in Meriden that actually set the Knights going. It took off like a shot. The dynamic between New Haven and Meriden started the whole thing rolling.
The success in Meriden leads the way for councils across the state. But the good news is tempered by a sad change for Father McGivney. After 7 eventful years, he is told that he is leaving New Haven and getting his own parish. St. Mary's is packed when he celebrates his final Mass at the church.
There are many reports of the parishioners crying during his final sermon. The man was deeply loved. I don't know how we got through that final sermon, but you look at all the people sitting there looking up at you. I don't know how we kept the tears back.
On November 12, 1884, Father McGivney leaves St. Mary's Church for a final time and heads towards the town of Thomaston, Connecticut, where he is to receive his own church and parish.
That was a shock, I'm sure, to his system. I mean, he was the man of the hour in New Haven. Everybody knew him. He walked down the street, everybody knew him. Then he went to Thomaston, which is like nowhere.
It's difficult for Father McGivney to leave New Haven, but this is really a promotion to him. It's a recognition of his great accomplishments at St. Mary's and presents him with new opportunities and new challenges.
At Thomaston, Father McGivney throws himself into reviving the parish community.
He was pastor in Thomaston here in Connecticut, and then they gave him subsequently the jurisdiction and duty to be pastor of a nearby parish. The responsibilities were doubled and so forth in a time when transportation wasn't too great. Shuffling and shuttling back and forth between the two parishes, and it wasn't easy. He had morning Mass in one and then subsequent morning Mass in another, and then back for the third Mass in the morning in another, in the original parish.
Through it all, Father McGivney remains quietly involved with the growth of the Knights of Columbus. And when they pay their very first death benefit in 1885, he is overjoyed. They are at last a financially creditable insurance organization, a salvation for Catholic families on the brink of bankruptcy, poverty, and destitution.
Now Father McGivney can see that his great idea not only can work, but it does work. His great idea has become reality.
But there are still great battles to be won in the face of prejudice and religious division. In New Haven, a family's tragedy will help Father McGivney build a bridge between two embattled communities. It is a story that began in 1883, 2 years before Father McGivney left St. Mary's. Dr. Edwin Harwood is the minister of the preeminent Protestant congregation in New Haven, Trinity Church. Trinity stands on the green next to Yale University. The wealthy Harwoods are at the very pinnacle of New England society.
It would be difficult to overstate the degree to which the Protestant establishment in Connecticut, in New Haven, looked up to Reverend Harwood and his position in the Episcopal Church.
In early 1883, a rumor begins to circulate about the surprising behavior of Dr. Harwood's eldest daughter, 22-year-old Alida. The news makes the society columns in many of the leading Connecticut papers. Rumor has it that Alida has been seen attending services at St. Mary's Catholic Church.
For her to go to St. Mary's Church for the services, for Mass, or for anything, really was a scandal. And it could be the source of great embarrassment for the church, for the family, for anybody connected with this.
Alida Harwood presents Father McGivney with a great challenge. He doesn't want to turn away someone inquiring about the Catholic faith. At the same time, her father is one of the most prominent Protestant ministers in New England. So Father McGivney has to proceed very delicately.
Her father was a rather stern man. He used religion as the stick to beat people with, and so it's, in a way, it's not too surprising that Alida would look for a religious experience that was a little less daunting and rigorous and bold.
Impressed by the gentle strength of Father McGivney's faith, Alida attends St. Mary's more and more, and the two become close friends.
Through her relationship with Father McGivney, she became convinced that she wanted to become a Catholic. Eventually, when the father realized what was going on, he opposed it very bitterly.
She decided to send her off to Europe in hopes that that would cure her. Well, she came back from Europe and had decided by that point that she wanted to be a nun.
Dr. Harwood is horrified. In an act of desperation, he sends Alida to Europe a second time. But his plan fails. Alida is still strong in her Catholic faith. When she returns, she contracts malaria. At first, the case isn't serious. She is well enough to help her younger sister, Honora, prepare for her wedding.
The younger daughter was engaged to be married to a very prominent young man. She disappeared one day and went to New York and married someone else entirely. And so the house was in an uproar.
News of the elopement makes the headlines. It is a terrible shock for the Harwood family, and especially for Alida. Her malaria takes a serious turn for the worse.
She became gravely ill, and it was apparent finally that she was going to die.
In and out of consciousness, Alida calls for Father McGivney. Her parents refuse to summon the priest to come from Thomaston to visit her. They still can't accept that their daughter has become a Catholic. Even in a fever, Alida insists that Father McGivney comes to give her last rites.
Her father simply didn't want to permit it. He finally relented. And Father McGivney came and administered the last rites.
He leadeth me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake.
Alida dies the next day. For 2 days, Dr. Harwood makes no plans for a funeral. He cannot accept that Alida has died a Catholic.
Her father wouldn't allow there to be any Catholic funeral, even though she had become a Catholic. And so her father actually closed up the house. It was a kind of denial that she had died. She was kept in her bedroom, laid out.
Things rather hung in the balance for a while, and it was Dr. Harwood's wife who finally had to approach Michael McGivney and say, please come over. Please help us do the best thing for Alida. It is a measure of the pastoral qualities of Michael McGivney that he was able, under very difficult circumstances, sit down with Dr. Harwood and work out an arrangement whereby the funeral would be an Episcopal funeral, but Father McGivney would participate.
Father McGivney wins the respect of the most influential Protestant minister in the region. With such great skills as a peacemaker, it's not surprising that Supreme Knight John Phelan turns to McGivney when the Knights hit a roadblock in 1888. Some Catholic men have set up a council in Providence, Rhode Island, but nobody joins. The Knights look to Father McGivney for help.
The Knights of Columbus is now a successful organization in Connecticut. They are about to take the next step on a journey that is going to lead to becoming a successful national and even international organization. But to take that step, they need the help, the guidance, the determination of Father McGivney.
Problem with that is that that's a different diocese. And Father McGivney was extremely reluctant to go ahead and set something up without the approval of the bishop.
It is an important test case for the Knights if they are to become a viable national organization. But there are problems.
Despite the enthusiasm for creating the council there, they were not getting any recruits. Everybody was waiting for some indication from the bishop that it was okay.
Then the challenge came when we had to go beyond the state of Connecticut, and we had to seek permission from all of the other bishops, the dioceses that we wished to expand into.
Father McGivney travels to Rhode Island in December 1888. His first port of call, the offices of the Reverend Matthew Harkins, Bishop of Providence.
The move into Rhode Island is a test of Father McGivney's diplomatic skills. He must go to a new bishop who doesn't know him, who doesn't know his organization, and convince this bishop to allow this new experiment into his diocese.
McGivney explains the object of the order and how it is helping so many widows and orphans in Connecticut. Bishop Harkins considers the matter and then gives Father McGivney his blessing. McGivney has cleared the way for the Knights to grow in Rhode Island and hopefully other states. Father McGivney's intervention in Providence is his last major effort for the Knights. The exhaustion that blighted the lives of Father Murphy and many other young priests of his generation at last catches up with Michael McGivney. His immune system is weak. In December of 1889,
and we are interrupting that fine program to take you back live for EWTN's coverage of the Knights of Columbus 133rd Supreme Convention, coming to you from the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania Convention Center. And I'm Doug Keck, and I'm joined on set by the Most Reverend Bashir Warda, Chaldean Archbishop of Erbil. And thank you so much, Archbishop, for being here.
Thank you.
And we know you're here for very serious reasons because of what's going on in your homeland. But we also want to say that you're a good friend of Joan, right? Joan Lewis, our wonderful bureau chief in Rome. And how do you know Joan Lewis?
Well, she visited us in 2009 when I was a rector of the Chaldean Seminary. I had to take the seminarians from Baghdad because of the difficulties and persecution, kidnapping priests, which made life of the seminarians very difficult. So we had to make a very hard decision of moving the seminarians from Baghdad to Erbil, where we built a new seminary for them. And she came as a to visit, and also to visit Christian villages who were filled of Christian refugees who were persecuted in Mosul and Baghdad. And so she spent a good time there, and she came back again for the consecration in 2010.
Mm-hmm. Now, you were here for the convention, and you saw part of Carl Anderson's call, really, not only for the Knights of Columbus here and all the councils, but really for the world to stand up against the persecution that's going on in the Middle East. Do you think that will help?
Yes, indeed. This call and such initiatives would definitely raise awareness among the Catholics around the world, among the Christians around the world, about what's happening in Middle East, the land of Christ. We are not guests in our homelands. We were there since the beginning of the Christianity. The apostles walked on our lands when they preached the gospel. When they went to India, they've established schools, monasteries, churches all over the place. I mean, the biggest, what we called one of the most important liturgical school was in Qatar, belonged to the Church of the East. So these lands has been, have received a lot of martyrs. The blood of the martyrs have purified all of these lands, and today, because of the persecution, these lands have been evacuated of its Christian people, and it's time to really take commitment to raise awareness. So I do believe such initiatives will help a lot.
And that's why you're here in the United States. You're coming here to try and raise awareness in different parts of, through the church itself, to realize the plight of your homeland?
Yes, that's one of the main tasks of my visit, to raise awareness, to tell the people the story, and also to encourage people to get involved in spreading the story. Be a voice for the victims who have been neglected, forgotten. It's quite difficult when you've been persecuted or forgotten. It makes a lot of difference when yes, feel persecuted but not forgotten by brothers and sisters. And we in Middle East, Christians in Middle East, we do believe that the Catholics in America would really be of a big help as a voice for their brothers and sisters persecuted in the Middle East, and also as a hand of charity to help the families stay. And that's the main task of the church today. What we are doing there is to help them to stay via providing the basic needs for a dignified way of living. It's not ideal, I have to say, but that's what we could do.
When you were saying that what people should stand up and do, is that also meaning talk to their representatives here in the United States, to ask the United States to do more, to stand up and ask the United Nations to stand up and do more? It seems interesting because you make a really good point, which is that there seems to be other situations where people are, you know, abused and thrown out of their homelands, but there seems to be this groundswell of support. But in this case, it seems unique that these people have this happening to them. We see it to some degree on our screens happening, but yet we don't seem to connect to it. And they are forgotten in that way.
Most of the debates when it comes to election goes to health assurance, education. But I think being a Catholic, it's also important to raise question or to question the policies which is affecting the global family. What we are really seeing and experiencing in this screen should makes us questioning the policies of our government, for example, about what we are doing outside America. And because of this policy of neglect would affect not just the Christians, but so many people there. We are talking today, for example, about 125,000 Christians who've been displaced and live in Kurdistan. But in Kurdistan, there is almost 2 million refugees from different parts of the country in Iraq. And that's because certain issues concerning policies in Baghdad, which the Americans have a lot to do with it. So yes, there was a mission which they've said was accomplished, which I doubt, but here you are. You went to a country and then getting in a chaotic, yes, there was a dictatorship, but the way to deal with that, with the issue after the war, have made all of this chaotic. You cannot say we are not responsible. Yes, as Iraqis, we are responsible for what happened, but also as the Americans and the international community also still responsible for what's happening there.
Right, we can't forget. And with someone like you here to spread the message, hopefully they won't forget here in the United States. Thank you so much, Archbishop Warda. We're going to take a break, much more ahead here from the Convention Center. Stay with us. And welcome back to our live coverage here of the Knights of Columbus 133rd Supreme Convention. Coming to you again from Philadelphia, I'm Doug Keck, as I've mentioned over and over again, and joined back on set by Andrew Walther, the Knights of Columbus's Vice President for Media, Research, and Development, a very busy fellow. He's shuttling in and out here in between our guests, so it's great to you come back. One of the things we wanted to talk about, and we talked a little bit about earlier, was your background in media and journalism and working at USC as a teacher. Now, you're also involved with some of the documentaries that the Knights of Columbus have put together, and we have the one, the John Paul II in America Uniting a Continent, which we were airing earlier, and I know Carl Anderson mentioned. There's some other programs, I think, on Universera that are coming up. Why don't you talk a little bit about this and why you see this as a natural outreach of the Knights of Columbus?
Well, I think the Knights of Columbus have a natural affinity for things that are formative in the faith in a way, and also for things that are that lend themselves to a charitable component. So we've done a number of documentaries over the years. We did one on our project in Haiti, which was 5 years of basically providing any child in need who requested it with a prosthetic and rehabilitation. Carl mentioned this program a little bit in his report, and there were some clips from that documentary there. You mentioned the John Paul and America documentary, which is really excellent. I mean, from country to country to country, John Paul came to America and really transformed the face of the continent in a powerful way. Dictatorships fell. He called people to do greater good. It was really a remarkable thing. And remembering that, we're understanding the good that people can do and the change that can be made through kind of a real vision, a real understanding of what should be, was something very, very good, I think. And John Paul did an excellent job of that, and the documentary recalls that. There are other documentaries coming up. I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here.
There was also one on Pope Francis, right?
Yes, we did one on Pope Francis. Right after he was elected, we went down to Buenos Aires. We interviewed a number of his friends. And by the time World Youth Day rolled around a few months later, our documentary was airing at this convention.
Right, exactly. So when the Knights are deciding to do something like this, how does that process work in the sense of looking at what should be done? Is it looking at what's not getting done?
I think it's a matter of finding a place where we can make an impact. With Pope Francis, no one knew who he was. And by going down to Argentina for a week and interviewing the people who knew him, we were able to give people an understanding of who this man that the world didn't know was. And that was a powerful thing. I think with what happened in Haiti, there were so many horror stories of what happened there that we were able to show people a very successful program, a program that helped an enormous number of people and really went far beyond what we had promised to do. We had promised to make these prosthetics available and put in a certain amount of money. We ended up putting in almost twice as much money, and we ended up helping 25,000 people in addition to the 1,000 people who got the prosthetic treatment. There were 25,000 others who got rehab treatment. It was just an amazing expansion of that program in a situation where all of the headlines were nobody's coming through with the money. And the Knights of Columbus were coming through with twice the money. So it was a heartwarming story and a good thing to show people the possibilities.
And how does that work with the councils? How are they involved? Are they promoting the fact when these things are out there? Do they play them at their meetings? How do the actual local councils do that?
Well, there are a number of things. For one thing, EWTN, among others, is a great outlet for these. For another, our members do buy them, do show them sometimes in parishes. At the parish near me in Durham, Connecticut, they were having a screening of the Pope Francis documentary and invited me to come, having no idea that I'd had anything to do with it whatsoever. And it was just a great moment to see that hard work paying off in that kind of way and people getting educated about the Pope.
Thank you so much, Andrew. We're out of time. We'll be back at 6:30 with our coverage of the State's Dinner. Coming up next, we will have EWTN News Nightly. Stay with us.